So glad to have you watching or listening, however you get this media, to Curiosity Not Judgment. Welcome in. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
So we are going to talk a little bit about kind of a balance, a scale, if you will. And I think this applies both in personal life and in business life. And Gary is a big fan of the quad chart, and this is something that can easily be graphed into a quad chart, but it's the intersection of excellence and grace. And what happens as we're discussing through a curiosity, not judgment lens, if you view somebody in a particular light, or your corporation, your business in a particular light, and are there curious questions that you can ask to maybe move yourself or move your team into another quadrant? And here's where we're going with that. So actually, I'm going to point it over to you. Can you give a brief overview of just kind of the principle of a quad chart and how we can think about this, keeping in mind that people are listening more than watching, and how do we have this dialogue?
Sure. So if you think about a graph from your graphing days back in school, you've got an x-axis, a y-axis vertical, and an x-axis horizontal. And if you plot two things like excellence, high and low, and grace, high and low, with 0 being the low on both, then you create a quad chart. So you basically then create a low, 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 high, high, low, high, high. And so in this case, you have either high excellence, low grace, low excellence, high grace, low excellence, low grace, or high excellence, high grace. And there's many ways to do this, but it's really good to plot two things with respect to each other, because then it can be instructive as to, for instance, Giant has one that I really like called the support challenge matrix. And that's a quad chart. Are you high and low on your support and high and low on your challenge? And that tells you what kind of a leader you are.
Right.
And this is much the same way. How is your business, how would you evaluate your business or your leadership style based on excellence and grace? Now, the reason why it's such a good curiosity, not judgment subject is many people would read this and they would judge their own organization or another organization instantly and say, they're low on both scales, or yeah, they're high on performance, but they're low on grace. And that's not the point. The point is, okay, so what? What do you do about it? And can we be curious and ask questions and help guide and influence our organization, our peers, or as you say, ourselves, into high excellence and high grace?
Yeah. And I want to start giving credit where credit is due. So this came to us from a local advertising firm called McKee, Walwork and Company. And they then cite the original company with this information as Praxis. And the website, if you'd like to look it up, is praxislabs.org. So we were poking around in the website a little bit before we recorded this episode. Some really interesting content in there. We did not find this laid out in a quad chart as we were searching for it, but I agree with you. I think this is an excellent opportunity to kind of imagine what quadrant do you find yourself in, or what quadrant do you find your organization in. And I do want to start on the self-analysis side of things, the self-questioning, because if you were to ask, with the two concepts of excellence and grace, how do you rank yourself? Are you high or low excellence in your regular kind of output, I would say, and are you high or low grace in your dealings with people? And of course, everyone naturally would want to say, well, I'm high in both, right? I operate in excellence and I'm always very grace-filled. But if you take a step back and you really consider the bulk of your interactions, both professionally and personally, what score would you give yourself? And so I think that's the first curious question that we have to begin to ask. And, I'm not going to ask either one of us to blurt that out loud. But as we, internalize that and think, okay, I could say for myself, I am a very emotive person. I am much more on the feeling spectrum, and so I really resonate even with the word grace. And I hope that in those two categories, I would hope that people remember me more for any grace that I would extend than excellence, though I want to operate in a very high manner in both. But just because of the way my personality is, I'm more concerned with my grace rating.
And a way to say that might be that I defer to that more often, or if you think about right-handed versus left-handed, I am more right-handed grace, and I'm going to default to that versus excellence. And I'm probably the other way around. I'm probably more of, look, I need to get the job done. What's the agenda here? Let's get moving, more than I am with grace. And I sometimes find myself frustrated with people who are saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we should plan this out first. Maybe we should, right? And I probably don't extend grace well enough for that in favor of let's get it done, or the excellence part of the job. But, a quad chart is not meant to be judgmental. Well, I should say, I would believe, and we would believe, that the proper use of this quad chart is not to be judgmental and to put people or organizations in one of these quadrants in everything that they do.
Sure.
Because I can tell you the answer, and I don't mind telling you the answer to this, is that am I high excellence or high grace all the time? The answer is no.
Sure.
And I can tell you that, for instance, when I'm driving, right, I'm high excellence, low grace, right? But if I'm with my granddaughter,
right,
I am high grace, low excellence, right? So who cares about the quality of the picture we're drawing, right? It's about being together. So I think it's very situational, and I think that's okay. So we don't want to paint someone in a corner, and certainly not attribute all of their actions to this. But I think it's instructful to look at and say, what is my intention in this area at work or at home or on the freeway? And is there a gap there?
Yeah.
And what can we do to influence ourselves or others intentionally into that gap?
Yeah. I do find it fascinating, though, that this particular article that was sent lumps some examples into the various quadrants.
I love those examples.
And,
actually.
I said to you, I want to err on the high grace side. Of course, I want to be high excellence, but if I'm going to have to be...
If I have to pick one.
Yeah, if I have to pick one in here, and I skew on the low excellence, high grace side, it labels the nonprofit sector as being stereotypes. Right. And guess where I've been working for the last 8 years? Nonprofit.
And to just expound on what Birgit's talking about here, in order to make an example, which I think are always instructful, it says that, and this is around kind of the market or marketplace, it says that high excellence, low grace, much of the private sector is stereotyped here. So business in general is stereotyped with high excellence, low grace. And it gives the example of Apple. And everybody knows, or if you don't know, you might be aware of the fact that Steve Jobs was known as a high excellence, low grace kind of leader. And he would drive Apple to excellence in everything they did, but maybe be a little harmful to the relationships along the way, right? And so people can identify with that. In the quadrant of low excellence, high grace, and this is what Birga's talked about, is much of the nonprofit sector stereotype there. People who are very passionate about what they're doing, and they're gonna save the world in this one area, but the excellent, and they're going to be very grace-filled with the people that are involved, but accountability kind of falls to the wayside, excellence kind of falls to the wayside, and therefore you get some version of mediocrity. And again, these are stereotypes. Sure. I want to be clear on that. The low excellence, low grace, they say much of the public sector. So this is TSA, the post office, things that you come across that are, people don't care as much, and there's probably not a whole lot of grace either. But just because people they're not incentivized or rewarded for either one in that situation. And maybe that's more on the organization than it is on the people involved, which is usually, that's a grace-filled term. But the high excellence, high grace, obviously that would be the goal. What's interesting to me is there's no example here.
Interesting.
So is it so hard to attain that no one ever gets there? I mean, but I mean, I think it's as instructful as the fact that there are examples in these other quadrants that there's not one
Yeah.
in the high. Now, hopefully we are all aware or have been part of one or are part of an organization that is high excellence, high grace, and that should be the goal.
You know, I am thinking back through my last umpteen jobs and where things got off track, or, you know, maybe where things had settled in a particular quadrant on this chart and just couldn't seem to shake loose. And in that moment of looking back that has happened here in the last 4 minutes or whatever, you know, it's interesting to think about, would there have been a practice, an exercise, an action that we could have taken that would have leapfrogged us out of that stereotypical box, right? And I'm speaking right now specifically of the nonprofit world because that's where I have been for so many years. And you're absolutely right. It's all about relationship. It's all about connecting at the heart level. But by and large, and I think we've talked about this in other episodes, so many of the individuals that are employed in the nonprofit sector are there because of their heart. They want to make a difference. They want to change their communities. They want to change the world. But they may not come armed with a lot of the skill set that is incorporated into the business world. And so often I have heard that they don't want the business regimen to be exemplified in that nonprofit space because it takes away the humanity, or it somehow compromises the heart of what the mission or the organization is trying to do. But I think what we're trying to say is there is absolutely room and a necessity for both at the table, because if you don't have high excellence showing up in your nonprofit, you are maybe not budget savvy, you are maybe not employing the right people, you're employing people that you like that maybe don't have the right skill set for a particular role. You know, the list can go on. And I say this because I've experienced so much of it. And it pains me to think about how many nonprofits have suffered because there has not been both equally represented at the table.
Well, and you bring up a good point, and so you're right, and that both need to be the goal, because if you're a nonprofit and you're not going for high excellence and high grace, then you're missing the mark, and you're actually not being good stewards of the very money that your donors or wherever you're getting your money, your grants are given to you for.
Yeah.
And I think that you're not meeting the expectation then of the folks who are donating to that, given the nonprofit status. But the same goes for the business sector or the private sector. If you are not practicing grace in where you get to, then are you really fulfilling the mission that you set out to do? Because is that long-term sustainable?
Right.
If you are just going for the almighty dollar, then that means that you're probably not treating not only your employees well with grace, but even your customers. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, one could argue that you're not going to be long-term successful. Mm-hmm. And so, again, if you're thinking about sustainability, both high excellence and high grace need to be there for the private sector and for the nonprofit. And by the way, I would submit that should be the public sector goal too.
Oh, without question.
And you hear a lot of people saying, well, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to run this city like a business, or I'm going to do this or that. And when I was in government, I used to hear people say, well, I think, Gary, that's good because you're going to make government run more like a business. Well, you can't run government like a business because it doesn't have the same reward systems. It doesn't have the same wherewithal. But you could strive for high excellence and high grace.
Absolutely. So if you find yourself listening, and as you are processing this, you can already just in your mind figure out a category or a quadrant that you yourself are in or your business is in, and you want to move out of that quadrant towards the block of high excellence, high grace. I want you, if you would please, to address some of the business side of things where you may be in a culture that's high excellence, low grace. If you find yourself in leadership in that area, what are some questions you can ask to start moving towards more grace?
I guess one of the main things, and I've been thinking a lot about this lately, is making sure people know that they are safe and trusted and that you're for them. I hope I'm answering your question, but basically, yes, we all have a goal here, but we're not going to kill each other in the process of doing it. And let's decide as a group that we can hold each other accountable, but we're going to do it in a way that we're all in this together, and we're not going to just leave someone, twisting in the wind. If you aren't succeeding, maybe it's because you don't have the support and the resources that we might be able to help you with to help get us all there. So sometimes when we divide up tasks and we're in a typical meeting in business and we say, okay, you're going to go do this, you're going to go do this, you're going to go do this, you're going to do this. And we just make the assumption that it's all going to converge perfectly together on a given date. And it's all going to work, and we're going to have a sale, or we're going to have a product, or we're going to have a whatever. And I think what we need to do is do some regular check-ins there where people are allowed to ask for help without feeling bad about it. People are allowed to say, you know what, I need some more resources here. And it's not, well, look, if you need more resources, maybe we need a different person doing the job. I think we need to have a basic sense of we're for each other in that to do it. I guess the way to approach this from a curious standpoint is to ask if you see someone struggling, if you're aware of it, instead of just taking care of your own thing and saying, well, I'm bringing my project in on time. Take a look around. Say, how you doing over there? Is there something I can do to help you? So that we can all win this together. Are we, if we catch people putting the product above the relationship, saying, hey, are we valuing the relationships as much as we are the outcomes here? As an example.
It occurs to me that maybe we should back up several steps and explain what we mean by both excellence and grace. And I can do it from the perspective of a nonprofit, and perhaps you from the perspective of, the business side of things. And I would say in the nonprofit world, and hear me say this just based on my own experience in the state in which I live, and we're both in New Mexico, and this may not apply across the board, but I think there are some common threads or some commonalities that are at least, I was going to say universal, but maybe just countrywide at least, that I think will resonate with you. But when I talk about excellence in the nonprofit realm, I talk about accounting and metrics done correctly and done on time. I'm talking about, you mentioned this earlier, you are being a good steward of the donor dollars that you are receiving, or the grant funds that you are receiving. And you are walking in integrity with what you are doing and how you are relaying the success of your mission as it pertains to reporting back to both your donors, or if you're reporting up to an organization that's giving you funding for a specific metric, that all of those things are being done with integrity and with excellence. And I would say also that whatever product or service you are distributing as a nonprofit is one of excellence. There is, again, this is my personal experience and things I've seen, there has been a whole lot of sloppiness. If there's a distribution of goods, whether it be food, furniture, electronics, medical equipment, as we're cleaning out our closets or our garages and we have this busted up, broken things, like, oh, we'll donate it to so-and-so. And that organization then in turn distributes that busted up, broken thing to the people that they're serving. That to me is not excellence. That is not excellence.
Yeah, but they'll be grateful for that because they have nothing.
No. Oh, don't get me started on that. That's a whole other podcast.
Well, I would say ditto on all those things, though, on the business side, right? And sometimes the investors might be different. It might be a big corporation to a skunk works or a smaller organization or a venture capital firm to it. But I think instead of donors, you could think of investors. So I think ditto on all of that on the business side. I think the business side, though, more tends towards the excellence. So what are they doing about the grace?
Right. And how do you define grace in a business setting?
And that's a tough thing to do. Every single word, as we've talked before on this podcast, wisdom is in the definition of terms. And so sometimes that word may evoke certain feelings or certain ideas or stereotypes. But really what grace is look, people deserve a modicum of respect, of being a human being, and that you don't just judge them and then say, okay, well, I don't like this person, or I put them in a box and say, this is what I always expect from these people. Grace is more along the lines of, everybody's on a journey. How can I help this person on their journey, and in relationship to the point where they can contribute by their skills into this organization towards our common goal? And how do we do that? And there's been various metaphors along the ways of this, like Jim Collins used to say, well, get the right people on the bus and then get them in the right seat in the bus. There's a lot to that than just saying those words, and that is, okay, are we getting people that are aligned with the organization from their personal goals along with the business goals to the point where that's even possible? Number one. Number two, once they're in the organization, maybe they didn't know and we didn't know that there would have been a better fit if we could put them here versus there. And is there an ability to make those adjustments? Right? And sometimes in a small business, it's hard because there's only one of a certain thing. But in a large business, you can move people around and adjust them by their known now skill sets, which sometimes they're not even self-aware to know them, into a place where they can contribute better and be happier and be satisfied with their work. And so I think that's the key, making sure that people are energized in part of their work versus de-energized, right? Yep. And so, the ideal ratio of that, as we've talked before, is 70-30, right? You got to have 70% of your work is energized, and 30%, we've all got to do the paperwork, so to speak, in my mind. And so are those things, are we helping people do that? Are we doing true human resources, right? And I think that's the key from the business side that I would say.
Well, and if we go back to the nonprofit side, talking about grace, I feel like that's available in spades, right? That is the MO for a majority of nonprofits, is extending grace to somebody who has fallen into difficult life circumstances, whether it's addiction, they've been victims of violence, they have been living in generations of poverty. There's lots and lots of grace to work with people and to help them come out of a situation that has kept them in a place of depravity or need, or a very challenging situation. But again, asking those questions, if you happen to be in nonprofit, of, are we striving for excellence, and what do we need to pivot in our daily doings that would lead us on a path towards excellence? I think these are really important questions. And I think they absolutely need some consideration, because I would argue that the happiest employees are going to find themselves in that quadrant of high excellence, high grace, because I think though we may have our lazy spells, we want to have excellence extracted from us, right? I think we are built to give our best. And we want to also be in a place where we feel like we're receiving high amounts of grace, because we are human beings. And maybe you didn't get a good night of sleep, or your kid, has had an injury and you need to take 3 days off because of medical appointments. We need grace as people in the workforce, whether nonprofit, business, whatever sector you find yourself in, but we also need to be challenged to produce our best.
Well, and going back to that, the podcast a few sessions ago on personal resilience, I think we each have a little bit of an accountability to work on our own personal resilience. Sure. And I think we can ask questions in that way. But I mean, you bring up an excellent point about, what is that proper balance? And one good exercise might be from a personal level is, okay, I only have so much energy to give. High excellence and high grace take energy. Sure. Am I going to do this in all parts of my life, and can I be honest with myself and say, you know what, on the road, I'm not going to do it? And is that okay? Yeah. It's a curious question.
Are you going to endanger yourself or others?
Well,
either with your emotional outburst or your poor driving?
That's exactly right. The exercise, I'm hoping, will come to the point of saying, no, I need to work on high excellence and high grace and all of those things, right. And I can't afford it. But the fact is, it takes energy.
It does.
And so that means we need to keep our energy up to the level of, in the things that we're involved in, we deliver high excellence, high grace. Maybe for someone like me, that means saying no, because my limited energy shouldn't mean that I sign up for so many things that I allow myself to fall off the cliff on grace or excellence on some things. Maybe it's don't do those things or cut it off to the point where I can bring high excellence and high grace to everything I do.
Well, I hope this has been a challenging, in a good way, conversation that gets you thinking about yourself and how you're wired and maybe where you find yourself employed. And are there curious questions you can ask to get yourself into a better quadrant, on the path towards high excellence and high grace? So I will link up the Praxis Labs information in the show notes, and I will seek permission to see if I can copy this email to put it in there. I'm not going to commit to that just yet because I don't have permission, and until I do, I won't put it in there. But please do check out the details as they become available. You're always welcome to get in touch with us through the website curiositynotjudgment.com. We do have a Facebook page if you'd like to find us there as well. And until next time, we'll wish you a very good week.
Take care.